with this esteemed panel here about the hard truths about what is causing the difference in sustainable development between emerging markets and developed markets. Now, I'd like to try to make this session as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, then I would like you to just shoot them through up front so that we get a feel for what are some of the hot topics that the audience wants to cover. I think the instructions for the pigeonhole is somewhere. I can see it here, but www.pigeonhole.at, and then you can enter the passcode SFFxSWITCH. And so please send through your questions, and then I can have a look at them live and just inject them in as we speak. All right, let's get started, shall we? Let's start with the big picture. It was clearly shared by the UN Director General as well that we are nowhere near meeting the pathway to 2 degrees and well below. And so what do you think is causing this difference in the ambitions versus the reality today? And what are the key differences you see in the emerging and the developed markets? Now, if I may, maybe I can start with Jeff from the perspective of science and the academic world.
Thank you very much, Herry. I hope you can all hear me okay. Yes? Good. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm very much on the tech side of Fintech. I'm an environmental scientist and engineer, trained ecologist, and I've spent most of my career looking at climate change science and solutions for mitigation and adaptation to climate. And basically the United Nations and the IPCC, which I've served as an expert reviewer, is telling us unless we make rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in society, then we face catastrophic climate change and we face an existential threat to our global civilization and the collapse of our ecosystem. So that's about the measure of it. I think the Secretary General is right on the nail. He has identified climate change as the defining issue of our time. And he's also said that climate change is running faster than we are. In other words, if we're going to address this issue, we need to seriously escalate our strategies for dealing with climate change. And I think the figure you mentioned about 3.2 degrees centigrade of temperature rise, this is a fairly conservative estimate. On a business as usual pathway, we're looking at between 4 and 6 degrees of temperature rise by the end of the century. So this is why the Secretary General is talking about existential threat.
Yeah. So just as a summary, what is science telling us? What are the consequences if that increase in figures do not come down?
Well, again, the United Nations was very clear in October last year when they delivered the 1.5 degrees centigrade model. With that came a very clear carbon budget, and basically if we don't adhere to the targets under the Paris Agreement and more, we will shoot straight through that carbon budget and we will face catastrophic climate change. So basically we need to move sooner, bigger and faster.
Yeah. Okay, so I am quite certain that none of us on the stage here are denying what Jeff is saying, right? And I mean, Daniel at Standard Chartered, Jessica at Ping An, and Stanislas and Amundi, these are all big global institutions. So what really is stopping your institutions from funding the projects that's going to allow to narrow the gap? And do you see any differences in that development market and emerging market context as well? So maybe I can start with Daniel.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me say a very big thank you to you and to the organisers for putting on such a distinguished panel to talk about such an important topic. Starting with Standard Chartered, we announced last year some big changes. So first of all, we said that we would no longer finance any new coal power projects anywhere in the world, and I think we're the first international bank to commit that globally. I think secondly, we announced that we were going to measure, manage, and ultimately reduce our Scope 3 emissions. So to try and put that into context, what that means is that we are working out the amount of emissions generated by our lending. So if we were to lend 100% of, let's say, Exxon's banking needs, we would take 100% of the emissions generated by Exxon. And so what this is going to allow us to do is make sure that our activity is aligned, getting us back on track for a less than 2 degrees, hopefully substantially less than 2 degrees warming. So I think we're trying to do a lot, and I know others are doing lots as well. But I think it is important to distinguish between the emerging markets and the developing markets, and I would talk about sort of 4 factors. First one is, these economies are at very different stages of development. We have a situation that in many markets across emerging markets, per capita incomes are still very low. And in fact, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which is kind of this holistic view of development, we're nowhere to achieving those by 2030 either. Second is population sizes. So in sort of absolute terms, many countries within Asia are right at the top of the emitters. But if you look at it on a per capita basis, Asia has about 49% of global, 60% of global population, but is only accounting for about 49% of emissions. Somewhere like Africa has 18% of global population, but accounts for 4% of emissions. So there's a real difference in terms of the amount of per capita emissions that's being generated. I think the third thing is impact. And unfortunately, the sad truth is climate change is going to significantly impact emerging markets, probably harder than developed markets. 4/5 of the people that will be impacted if we go to 3 degrees in terms of flooding sit in Asia. Africa has 19 cities of over 1 million people who are at substantial risk from significant climate change. So the impact is probably going to be hardest on those that have possibly contributed the least to global warming over the longest. And the fourth and most important, I think, in terms of where we're sitting, is access to capital. There is a lot of capital available in developed markets. That is not the case in emerging markets. And I think one of the things that needs to be really solved for is how do we get capital to move to where it really matters.
Thanks for that, Daniel. So Stanislas, I know that Amundi has already funds and mechanisms that's looking to bridge that gap. But maybe you can just share just a little bit about some of the solutions that you see in bridging the difference between development and emerging. Perhaps you can even share what do you think is the difference between DM and EM when it comes to sustainability and climate change, and what kind of solutions can be deployed at scale beyond just Amundi's efforts.
Good afternoon to everyone. I would say to put it in a nutshell, we have the money in developed countries craving for yield because they're protecting and managing money of savers, and you have yield in the developing world. And at the same time, the emerging world is confronted big time to climate risk, climate opportunities, and is the driver of transition. So how can you link the dots and make sure with financial engineering that you connect the money with the projects, at the same time packaging your risk in an acceptable manner by asset owners and institutional investors, and also, of course, set up the frameworks, data frameworks, reporting, assessment frameworks that can enable you to really select the issuer and institutions with the most, with the greater impact. So I would say on climate, this is not the worst issue of sustainability because at least you have one indicator, carbon, for instance, which is very legitimate, and even though it's sometimes difficult to report and measure climate carbon footprints, at least there is no discussion on what we should measure. There, of course, we have to fight for assessment framework, available data that we can use to do that, and We're starting doing it with IFC to have structured green bonds in the emerging market. We've also done it more recently with the AIIB to try and embark corporates in the emerging world, notably in Asia, on the transition. And where you might have a common ground between developed countries and emerging countries, is that you also have, of course, institutions that might be very useful in monitoring transition, but do not have access to green finance in developed countries. And for instance, we also developed with EIB a framework through which we will go to corporates on the debt market in Europe that do not necessarily have access to green finance, do not necessarily issue green bonds, but are very useful if we want to accelerate transition.
Yeah. So then just moving on to Jessica, so you predominantly operate in emerging markets, of course global operations, and you cut across the financial product base, insurance being a big part of it. So what kind of, some may argue, whilst the rest of the world is busy talking about taxonomies and policies to be set, actually funding simply has to flow, there's no time to wait. So what's your view, and what have you seen happening in China amongst other countries that you see has worked from policy perspective, from projects that got funded perspective, and how is climate change going to impact your business moving forward?
So before I answer that directly, I do want to make a statement that I think when MAS invited me for this panel, I thought it was very important that as one of the co-CEOs that I actually attend this. And I think that despite everything that you say, that when Secretary General, etc., say it's very important, I don't think that many of the institutions, including ourselves and many of them, this is a self-selected group. Frankly, this is an important enough topic that we should have 10 times more people than here. If I were to go and give a speech on Fintech, which I have done in the previous days, usually I have 10 times more people here and everyone listening. And I think this group, the fact that you guys are here, is probably a self-selected group who's actually really passionate about this topic. And I think the major big problem, be it emerging markets or development, is that I think not many people have translated that important thing to the sense of urgency that it makes it priority. Right? Most of us put it in our ESG somewhere in our annual reports. When your definition of what is green financing, frankly, is quite loose in classifying. Most of us maybe just want to get subsidy. I mean, we are one of the biggest green financer in China. I mean, China is already the second largest green bond issuer globally. We issue 10% of the green bonds in China, and yet I think it's not enough. So I think for this to really solve what you're talking about, where all of you, frankly, are much more experts than I am, we need a lot more top-down leadership and attention to this topic, and not just a small unit somewhere doing this. The second thing I wanted to say on how to really break through this, I think the actual facts, even if you want to do this, is that reality is that while technology is improving, it's not yet at a stage whereby it's straightforward, everyone would just adopt the new one. Otherwise, we don't have all these issues. I mean, take electric vehicles, right, which is one of the core things that China is really pushing on, right? It is a known fact that it costs $35,000 to actually manufacture an electric car, right, in days, which is about 80% more than a normal car. That's a fact. The money has to come from somewhere. Everybody also knows that electric vehicle, even if you account for the way that power is being generated, gives less carbon dioxide emissions than a normal car. So who's going to pay for that? And I think that's a very practical issue that has to come somewhere. And I think one of the things that inspired me, at least in China, is that on some of the agenda, once you see there's sufficient leadership attention to it, and you make this a priority, be it at the national level, or at the country level, or the corporate level, or at industry level, people start to solve this, right? So you see today electric cars being made a big agenda in China, whereby there is a commitment for 20%. There are real subsidies to 20% of all the total government subsidies are being made to the electric vehicles because it believes it's better to do that. So I think it needs this type of effort to really break through that. And I hope that, as this continues, we see more leadership and people willing to take that up instead of endlessly talking amongst many, many people, and everyone goes away feeling that it's such a great thing, we really must do it, and we are not doing enough. But yet, for decades, we haven't really made progress.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the fact that MAS has chosen the theme of sustainable development for the Fintech Festival in itself shows that there is movement at the leadership levels to see what can be done. I have a few questions coming through. So this is some are related to what can be done on the broader scale, and some are directly to private institutions. So maybe I'll start with, and anyone feel free to contribute here. Given the urgency of combating climate change and knowing that climate change will cost businesses millions of dollars and if not billions or trillions, why are many corporations still primarily profit-driven?
Well, I mean, so I actually don't think there is a being profit-driven. Frankly, needs to incorporate being climate aware, and I say that in two parts. I think first of all, the question sort of alluded at the beginning, there is a significant potential cost coming out of climate, whether that's in terms of the fact that we have seen losses in insurance from natural disasters over its long-term average, I think, for the last 5 years, whether that's how you build climate resilience into new infrastructure, whether that's the potential impact from changes in carbon prices if you're locked into a very heavy carbon situation, or the other side, the opportunity. So we know that Asia needs about, I think, $26 billion of infrastructure spending over the next couple of decades, and that has to be financed in a way that is completely in line with these achievements around climate. And that's a big business opportunity. So I don't think it's a question of profit and climate being separate. I actually think we're just looking at it the wrong way. And markets can correct both ways. The value of something that is very climate unfriendly right now can go down over a period of time. And things that are very climate friendly, I would suspect, will go up over a period of time. It's just a question of looking at the right horizon.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think anything that tries to say to do this non-profit license is not sustainable. I think the trick is really, as I said, finding the sources of capital with the right duration to make that work. And I think simple things like LED was a great example. How with LED, if you look at just the actual replacement costs, if you look into the whole lifetime costs, is very different. So I think it's really about finding that equation to do that.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, we're saying that there needs to be incorporation bigger.
Yeah.
It's happening already, where the ESG or environmental, social, and governance considerations are really becoming coming into the heart of the investment decision-making process, whether that be institutional investors or banks, and that's happening at different speeds depending on the country, but it is happening. So another question from the audience, and it's kind of like how can we push that to happen faster, I guess, with huge divergent views, and I would like someone to help define what the divergent views are, with the huge divergent views on this topic amongst global country leaders like the US. How must climate change challenges be addressed?
You mean the US as a leader on climate change?
No, as in there's different... I don't think I should be laughing on stage, but I don't think that was the meaning.
I think that you commented on the development of markets on ESG, referring to institutional investors. What's very interesting is also that, general public and banks and wealth management not only are also in very strong demand of ESG right now. So it's not only an institutional affair. It has become very widespread. And I have no doubt of the momentum created by the market. So how do we react to that? I have no worry again on the E pillar, and especially on climate, because here again you might think whatever you want about commitment of several countries, of authorities, to fight climate change. But even in the US, you have many institutions at the forefront of fighting against climate change with very mature strategies, and we have to address that. And I would say that maybe where you have more differences in priorities, in indicators that people want to follow, are more on the S, And this is also, even if it's not exactly our issue today, but we must keep in mind that if we want to be effective and efficient on the climate round, we also have to embark the social issue at the same time, so that our proposal and our solutions are sustainable in time and accepted by societies. Otherwise, it won't work. So, and here it's a bit trickier, because again, we're not talking about exactly the same issues. For instance, on social inequalities or different social issues, whether you are in Northern America, in Europe, in Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. But again, on climate, I don't think there are that many differences. It only relates to the difference of sectors, of level of developments, economic differences.
So, you brought up a very good point, Stanislas, that often in the field of sustainability, and that covers all of ESG, the discussion currently, most of it touches upon environment or climate change in particular. Now, in the emerging markets context, there are also voices that ask, what should come first, social or environment, when there's people who don't have access to energy? Should we really be pushing for no energy rather than coal energy, right? If there was no alternative today. Do you have a view, Jeff?
Maybe I can make a comment here if I may. So basically we're talking about the flow of capital from developed markets into emerging markets. There's a lot of interest, and it's very commendable that the Monetary Authority of Singapore has put sustainable finance at a part of a conference like this. And from my perspective, there's two key reasons why the money isn't really flowing. I think there's a fear factor in terms of the governance and administration and flow of that capital into an emerging market. Where's it going to go? People are worried about corruption and return on investment. I think the other factor is not really understanding what's required in terms of the technology. So again, I come back to the science and the engineering. And I think I can illustrate this point with a practical example. So in the last week I was working in Cambodia under a project that was administered by the United Nations Development Programme. And the project was about reducing carbon emissions from Cambodia's textile industry. And of course that industry is very important in terms of social development, economic welfare, women's rights and so on. That's all fantastic. But there was a big concern about the disposal of waste from the textile industry, not only in terms of carbon emissions, but the pollution it creates in terms of dangerous organic pollutants like dioxins. And the project was actually financed from the private sector in America. I won't name the company, but that company was basically hiring Cambodian workers to make clothing, which would then be re-exported back to America. And basically it took a scientist and an engineer like me to go in and really understand what the operational process was and how we could lower the carbon footprint and protect people from exposure to these horrible chemicals. It wasn't rocket science, but it was a beautiful project because it was administered by a highly respected organisation, the UNDP. It was funded by the private sector, and they had the foresight to hire a scientist and engineer like me to deliver a credible, meaningful, sustainable solution. So with the right governance and control and the right interface between the financial sector and people like me, I truly believe that we in the developed market can deliver sustainable solutions to emerging markets. So that's just one example. There are many more.
I think there are many parties who can make it work. My personal view is that if you really want to have the most scalable, impactful, it has to be led by the government. I mean, it's actually very nice to hear the story of the individual corporate wanting to do that. But until you have the government's kind of importance to this and through the infrastructure and incentives, it's very difficult for the rest. I'm seeing some of the questions, for example, how would it be possible that all fossil fuel investments of BlackRock, etc., stop immediately to be invested in renewable? Look, even in these organizations, even I've named the top 10, 20 to stop it, there are hundreds of financial institutions in any market, actually, even in any small country that until it makes it a priority. So, I mean, on your example, we're working with Shenzhen government, for example. China has made this zero pollution tolerance. Now, for a long time, it was just a policy, but there's no accountability. It's very difficult. Who polluted the river? I mean, frankly, it's not the big companies who pollute it. It's actually the millions of SMEs and small ones, and you are not sure who actually polluted, how much percentage should I account for the ability. So Shenzhen government created so we're building for Shenzhen government an end-to-end monitoring platform that incorporates not just IoT, but we actually build models for different emission pollutants. Even the river, we actually model it. For every 1 kilometer cube, we actually put which company, what kind of emissions, etc., so that you can actually enforce accountability. Now, of course, that's an extreme case with Shenzhen. They're a fairly rich and progressive country, and they really want to be smart city and stuff. But until you do that, right, you won't get the 3 million SMEs in Shenzhen actually looking at this and making it a priority. The bankers, the tech companies will follow. So I really believe if there's one person to change, I really believe that it has to start with the government of local cities, etc., who believes that, look, it's just not short-term economic gains, but who believe, like what Daniel was saying, that economic gains plus, the green aspect makes it much more sustainable long-term economic gains, and then actually creates the infrastructure, regulatory guidelines that to do. So personally, I think that would be the greatest impact. And I think this other point about, I think someone asked about recommendations for uni students. I think this is also inconsistent with what the younger people want. I mean, I look at my girls who are still in their kind of secondary and primary school. I mean, they don't care about not just like earning money and stuff. They care about younger people in the after the millennials care a lot more about the environment. And I think this is in line with everything. So I think once you have the top-down leadership, the rest of the corporates, the employees, I think has no problems actually getting there. But it has to be in the mainstream. Based on individual efforts, it's just too difficult because every time you're fighting for various things to do that.
I want also to comment on the question you answered to on fossil fuels and coal. And this is very interesting because it also relates to the social issue. You probably know that the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investments of the UN, came out with a new initiative on just transition. So what is a transition that is also at the same time just from a social standpoint? And here again, we're thinking only of what does it mean for just energy transition? And you're perfectly right. People have the right to energy access. I mean, we can't avoid that. So how can you at the same time think about transition? So obviously you're not going to retrieve from entire sectors all of a sudden, disrupting employment, social balance in certain territories and all that. And at the same time, of course, be credible in your drive on transition. So maybe the idea there is to assess what does it take to have a good transition, properly monitored. So it takes a bit of time. Again, if you want to be credible, you have to be transparent and to report on what's happening and the improvements. And at the same time, find the right measurement and system and frameworks to tap the middle of the ranking corporates and issuers so that you can accompany them in the transition and not, of course, put all the money in the ones that are already very good, because that won't have the impact you want on the short run.
Yeah.
Maybe if I mean, stepping back for a second, maybe just picking up the three themes that have been touched on, but how do we really accelerate, I think, what is some good pockets in various different countries over a big period of time to hit the transformation needed? I think the first one is absolutely consumer pressure. So everyone in this room, the buying decisions that we all take, the conversations that we're having, the decisions that we're taking about where to invest our pensions, if we have them, where we are buying from. That is actually leading, I think, to a significant change in awareness across the private sector, irrespective of where government does or doesn't go. Clearly it's going to be helpful if government does go there. But the second thing really is technology, and I think we cannot, especially sitting here in the Singapore Fintech Technology Conference, we can't underestimate the power of technology here. Renewables are now cheaper than coal in India and China. By 2021, they will be cheaper in Indonesia and Vietnam and most of Southeast Asia. By 2023, most of Asia will have access to renewables at a cheaper price than coal. By 2030, 40 to 60% of all coal will be uncompetitive, existing coal, uncompetitive compared to renewables. That is driving a wholesale change in the way that we can generate power, and we will see the electrification of various other sort of supply chains drive that over a period of time. So I think technology here is really powerful. But the thing we haven't mentioned so far that's key, particularly in emerging markets, is how do we get this to countries that haven't got the big capital markets, who can't afford it. And in here, I think blended finance plays a critical role. So that is being smart about how we can combine government funding on one hand with private sector capital and use that money to catalyze private sector to invest in countries and places that it wouldn't otherwise do. We've mobilized more than $5 billion in blended finance over the last 5 years into things like food security, renewables, sustainable infrastructure. And I really do think that's one tool of many that can really help start driving some of this investment change into countries otherwise that at the moment are struggling to get there.
So you have the view that to help funding flow in certain countries, either it needs a concessionary funding of some sort, or if it really is true that it's the risk is too much for a commercial entity, an international commercial entity to stomach, should there be differing expectations within the commercial organizations, whether that be ROE, if that really is the case, that it is seen that these projects in harder countries actually bring down the returns?
I mean, I think part of it, again, comes back to, something we haven't also talked about, which is the price of carbon. So at the moment, I think the average global price of carbon is around $2. The IMF estimates that really to tackle climate change, it needs to be, I think, around $75, right? That's a significant change. Now, my view is the market will correct for that at some point. When that happens, I don't know. So this comes back to the point around what horizon have you got to look at. But the key thing that I think is not about trying to generate one project and look at one project, is how do we generate billions of dollars of project? And there I do think we need to create markets that don't exist, or we need to catalyze new investment that currently isn't flowing. And that's why I think blended finance can play a role. I think capital markets, the emergence of green bonds has been a really positive development. But being, I guess, a bit provocative, I'd point out that if you exclude China, last year, record year for green bonds, less than 6% of those went to emerging markets. So I think the question for all of us as well is how do we get green bonds and capital market solutions again into the most vulnerable countries that really need it? So I think the tools are there, but there does need to be a bit more collective effort to try and solve for it.
I just think that at some point, I would agree with Daniel that technology will improve to a certain level, such that actually it makes even short-term economic sense. The challenge is going to be the incubation period, because a lot of technologies only get up to their base of scale. Right? So I think what's needed is the kicker in that period to make it economically viable. Right? It's just that period of time, right? So, like for example, solar panels is one where you see just a sudden kind of takeoff, through that. So therefore, I believe that is. I personally have a view that it cannot be just a financial services led. I think capital markets and financing is a very important part and lever to hook people on, but has to work in tandem with specific industries and solutions, because what we're talking about is very specific. Right? When we talk about renewables and stuff, it's very specific to the type of technology. It's very specific to different countries, right? Which is a very different type of profile. And if its industry sector solutions can be created together in very targeted areas, then I think this can have a lot more traction to that.
So talking about technology,
yeah.
And this in fintech, I'm sure there's quite a number of sustainable fintechs in the room. And for the sake of the discussion, we'll define fintech as technology quite broadly that can be deployed into financial institution sector. So if you were on the advisory panel to some of these fintechs that's looking at sustainability related aspects, what would be some of your key advice? Where are the opportunities both on the EM and DM side?
Technology spoken about just in the last few minutes. The good news is that the technologies are being developed very rapidly despite the constraints financially.